All right, welcome. Good to have everyone with us. In case you're wondering what call you're on today, we are here for the Homes for All monthly tenant union training call. Want to talk to you a little bit about our belief strive strive to practice language justice. I'm going to turn it over to one of our partners, Antenna Language Justice Collaborative, to share with you how we will practice language justice today. Take it away, Anna Paula. I think we might have lost Anna Paula.
De nuestro compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje, entonces vamos a pasarle a nuestros compañeros de Antena Los Ángeles. Entonces, buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es José Eduardo, esta es mi compañera Ana Paula y juntos formamos parte de Antena Los Ángeles.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ana Paula, sorry, José Eduardo, and this is Ana Paula, my colleague, and we are together part of a collective called Antena Los Ángeles.
Antena Los Ángeles se dedica a fomentar la justicia del lenguaje.
Antena Los Ángeles is dedicated to foster language justice.
La justicia del lenguaje es la idea que todos tenemos el derecho a escuchar, a entender y ser entendidos en el idioma que se nos sea más cómodo.
So language justice is the basic right that we all have to understand and be understood in the language that we feel most comfortable in.
Y también de crear espacios bilingües o multilingües donde ningún idioma domine sobre los otros.
And to create bilingual or multilingual spaces. Hear us now?
Can you hear us now?
Okay, sorry.
Sí. Okay. De nuevo. Buenas tardes, buenos días. Mi nombre es José Eduardo, esta es mi compañera Ana Paula y juntas formamos parte de Antena Los Ángeles.
So good morning, good afternoon. My name is José Eduardo and this is my colleague Ana Paula and together we're part of a collective called Antena Los Ángeles.
Antena Los Ángeles se dedica a fomentar la justicia del lenguaje.
Antena Los Ángeles is dedicated to fostering language justice.
La justicia del lenguaje es la idea que todos tenemos el derecho de escuchar, entender y ser entendidos en el idioma que se nos sea más cómodo.
So language justice is the basic idea that we all have the right to be heard, understood, and be understood in the language we feel more comfortable in.
También es la creación de espacios bilingües o multilingües donde ningún idioma domine sobre los otros.
It's also about the creation of bilingual and multilingual spaces where no language dominates above others.
El día de hoy vamos a crear un espacio bilingüe en inglés y en español y para eso les vamos a pedir que nos echen la mano.
So today we're going to create a bilingual space in English and in Spanish and we're going to ask you to lend us a hand. Yo creo que nada más
Sí, sí. Cuando hay veces las personas hablan muy, muy rápido o hablan muy, muy bajito, entonces es difícil entenderlas para interpretar.
So when people are speaking very, very, very fast or very, very, very softly, it's very, very hard to understand them to interpret.
Les vamos a dejar saber a través de la caja de chat para que la persona hablando o hable más fuerte o hable más despacio.
So we're going to let you know through the chat box if we need the person who's speaking to speak louder or to speak slower.
También les vamos a pedir que solamente una persona hable a la vez. Como intérpretes no queremos tener que privilegiar una voz sobre la otra.
So we'll just ask everybody to have one person speaking at once. We don't want to privilege and interpret one voice over the other.
Si tienen cualquier problema, no escuchan bien o no entienden algo, por favor déjenos saber a través de la caja de chat.
If you have any problem, you're not listening, you're not hearing well, please let us know through the chat box.
Por último, es un honor colaborar de nuevo con Homes for All y Right to the City y es un honor estar aquí con ustedes creando este espacio bilingüe en la llamada el día de hoy.
Lastly, it is an honor to be collaborating again with Homes for All and with Right to the City Alliance and be with all of you creating this bilingual space. Thank you.
Gracias.
All right, thank you so much. And just as a reminder for folks, on the screen you see how to use the chat box. This is where we will be pulling questions throughout the program today. And we also invite you to tweet, social media share any of our links there about this episode. And just as a reminder, in case you are talking too fast, I will be doing this. And if I can't hear you, I will be doing this. Okay? All right. Again, for those just joining us, welcome to the Homes for All Tenant Union Monthly Training. I'm Darnell Johnson, your host today, and I'm with Right to the City Alliance. The purpose of this call today is to share stories, models, and learn from each other and support each other in building tenant unions and winning. I will give you some background and of the context of this call, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presenters from City Life, Vida Urbana, and the Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester to share their stories, and then we're going to follow up with some question and answer. Right to the City Alliance seeks to create regional and national impacts in housing, human rights, urban land, community development, civic engagement, criminal justice, immigrant rights, and environmental justice. The Right to the City was born out of the desire of members and organizers and allies around the country to have a stronger movement for urban justice. Right to the City asserts that everyone, particularly the disenfranchised, not only have a right to the city, but as inhabitants have a right to shape it, design it, and operationalize it in an urban human rights agenda. Homes for All, the Right to the City campaign initiated and now supports Homes for All, which is a translocal campaign to win affordable, dignified, and sustainable homes for all people, where residents have democratic control over their communities. Homes for All is rooted in the vision that housing is a human right. The campaign engages those most directly impacted by the crisis through local and national organizing, winning strong policies that protect renters and homeowners and shift the national debate on housing. We organize through three translocal tracks: renters' rights, development without displacement, and community control over land and housing, to build power toward a world where people and the planet come before profit and commodities. Since its founding in 2013, Homes for All has grown to include 68 grassroots community organizations in 38 different cities and in 24 states across the country. This cause is organized by the Renters' Rights Committee of the Homes for All campaign, which supports the building of a powerful tenant union movement rooted in strong local and citywide unions across the country. We believe the housing crisis is not going to stop anytime soon. It continues to grow and it happens to be deepening. Currently, there are 43 million renter households in the country. As we all know too well, the majority of renters are suffering from poor conditions, unjust evictions, and/or high rents. Half of renters cannot afford their rent. 1 in 4 pay more than half of their paychecks to the landlord. While the crisis cuts across race, class, gender, and it's in the working class communities of color and women that we feel are and we know are hit the hardest. The renter class includes many different sectors of people. Next slide. Although our situations may vary, what everyone in the class shares is common, and that we do not fully control our housing and land. In the past, at times, the movement has only thought of renters as tenants with private landlords, but we see renters as including the following: tenants in multifamily buildings and with private landlords, tenants in single-family homes with corporate landlords, public housing residents, Section 8 and project-based Section 8 tenants, houseless families and individuals, single-room occupancy tenants, manufactured park home residents, and even low-income homeowners who we see as bank tenants who lose their homes with missed payments. Next slide. We believe that it's important that we take time in our unions and communities to understand the root causes. We see the cause of the crisis as a profit-driven system that sees housing and land first and foremost as commodities to generate profits for corporate landlords, banks, developers, and investors, often with government support. We believe white supremacy has always continued to shape land and housing policy in this country, from the expropriation of land from indigenous peoples to the land denied from former slaves to redlining and restrictive covenants, urban removal, gentrification, and subprime loans. We believe there are clear solutions to the housing crisis that have proven to work, but most elected officials and policymakers refuse to support because they choose to serve the interests of corporate landlords, the real estate lobby, and other forces that profit greatly from this system. Two primary solutions that we see are, next slide, rent control. For rent control, for us, what it means is that building a tenant union and winning collective bargaining agreements with the landlord, guaranteeing affordable rent with or with no or minimum increases, preserving public housing or protecting project-based Section 8 complexes, and strong rent control laws that include all Section 8 renters. We see rent control as a critical step to stabilize our communities, our families, and our lives, to halt mass evictions, the rent hike, and the horrible conditions. But rent control is not the end, don't get it twisted. As long as there is a landlord, they will seek to undermine the rent control and maximize their profits. Our goal is community control over land and housing, where we see land and housing are taken off the market and collectively owned and democratically controlled by residents who live on the land and in the community. To win rent control for all and ultimately community control, we must develop a strategy and goals for the next 10 years. Winning will require we build a powerful movement that includes thousands and thousands of tenant unions across the country, millions of tenants organized, a national tenant union, bold action taken by our groups. So towards this end, these calls that we're having today are dedicated to sharing our stories, our models, and learning from each other and supporting one another. Next slide. So let's get right to it. Why you came today. Our first story is by City Life leader Ivana. They are a founding member of the Homes for All campaign, and they happen to be rooted right outside my back door here in Boston. Our speakers for today are Ronell Remy, who is a community organizer, Andreas De Castello, who's also a community organizer, and Steve Meacham, who coordinates some of the community organizing that happens through City Life. Also, don't forget, as they do their presentation today, please remember the chat box is where you can put questions that we'll answer during a question and answer period. Ronell, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can take it away.
Actually, I think, Darnell, we're starting at the other end of the list.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay, we'll start there. No problem. So Steve, we'll start with you.
And we'll go to Andres and then Ronell. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be presenting on this call. So some basic facts about City Life. Where do we organize? We're really organizing all over Boston proper and nearby working class suburbs. We really have a metropolitan campaign. Who are the communities that we're organizing in? In addition to Boston itself and suburbs, where we're active mainly in communities of color. And who is City Life? City Life is a kind of organizing core. City Life includes staff who are hired from the base and a large group of skilled volunteers. We've been organizing against displacement and for community control of land and housing for 45 years. This is our 45th anniversary, which we will celebrate on May 19th, Malcolm X's birthday. So next slide. So our organizing model, we call it the sword and the shield and the offer. which has gotten around a bit now. Our organizing method refers to, number one, the shield is legal defense. It's all of our legal allies, is knowing our rights. The sword is public protest, everything from vigils and actions and civil disobedience to sending in letters to a corporate landlord with copies all over to all the legal and policymakers. And the offer is getting buildings out of the market and into community control. So going to the next slide. City Life sponsors 2 mass meetings per week in the metropolitan area. We have one in Jamaica Plains section of Boston and one in the East Boston section. And together these meetings draw over 100 people each week. You can think of this as a kind of citywide tenant union meeting. It even includes some homeowners, as Darnell said, who are facing foreclosure or post-foreclosure eviction by banks. And those take place every week, and it's out of those mass meetings each week that we organize our protests and political activity. We are involved in what you might call defensive campaigns to prevent displacement, but we wage those campaigns in a way that they are developed as offensive campaigns. So really our goal is to challenge and redefine what is accepted as common sense out there in the main culture. What is legal obviously isn't what is just or moral. We start with what is morally right, and by defending people against displacement, we are flipping the narrative on what is moral. Just by simply standing in the doorway of somebody who's being evicted for profit, we are flipping the narrative about what is moral, and that's vital. I think probably vital in any city where any of us are organizing to do that. So the next slide. Many opportunities, you could say that there are many opportunities for the general public to learn about our campaigns and show solidarity. We're certainly doing a lot of outreach. We're doing a lot of canvassing each and every week. All the actions that we do have, that are covered by the media are another way that people find out about us. Word of mouth is especially important. People who come to our weekly mass meetings go back to their friends and neighbors and they say, hey, this is really good, you ought to go there. We get referrals. So there's a lot of opportunities for the general public to learn about our campaigns, and we're trying to organize our campaigns in a way that does that. Through all of our campaigns and all of our meetings, one of our constant focus is really on leadership development, whether it's in outreach and mass meetings and actions or in political discussion circles. We're constantly focused on developing political leaders, on leadership development, basically developing volunteer staff. We know we want our movement to grow very rapidly, but there's no way that our staff's going to grow very rapidly, even if at all. So in order to expand the movement, we need dozens and dozens and scores of trained volunteers who are basically acting as unpaid staff. So I want to set the stage for kind of my 2 colleagues who are going to come after me. I want to describe really briefly some different types of tenant associations you could describe. You could say that we're involved in. One type of tenant association is one that happens in one large building that often meets in a community room or in the vestibule of the building. Those are sometimes, I guess, the most classic examples of a tenant association. Another one is an example of multiple buildings of the same landlord, where we're organizing in different neighborhoods, maybe even, but all owned by the same landlord. And Ronell is going to talk about an example of that. Another example is multiple buildings with different landlords in a single region or neighborhood, where we're bringing together people together in a kind of neighborhood or regional tenant association. And Andres Del Castillo is going to talk a little bit more about that example. So the citywide association that I mentioned earlier, by having these mass meetings each week, it's almost like a kind of citywide tenant association. So the types of housing that we organize in are mainly unregulated market and unsubsidized units, often with Section 8 vouchers, sometimes in public housing being privatized now or in expiring use buildings, HUD buildings. But right now our main practice is an unregulated market housing. So with that, I'm going to go over to my colleague, Andres Del Castillo, who will talk about the North Side organizing.
Hey all, my name is Andres. Like Steve said, I'm the lead organizer for North Side, which is a regional section It includes one neighborhood of Boston, East Boston, and the greater Boston suburbs, which are predominantly Latino, Chelsea, Revere, Everett, and a little broader than that. As a regional site, we're a predominantly Spanish-speaking site. We provide simultaneous language interpretation into English. And just as Steve was mentioning, we do include breakout groups in our meetings for tenants that either have the same landlord or need to be negotiating with their landlord in particular at the time. And then our site actually has really strong links to other issues. One of those, some of those issues are immigration and jobs, and others are the detention or like against the detention and prison industrial complex, as that links a lot to immigration and the consequences that, you know, getting pulled over can have for our immigrant communities. Right now, what we're seeing in our neighborhood a lot is building clear outs. So investors are buying up triple deckers, 2 families, and they're clearing up the whole building. And in a lot of occasions, they're also putting a clause that in order to buy, so part of their purchase and sales agreement will be that it needs to be delivered vacant. So putting the pressure on the sellers to actually do some of that evicting process. So those are all things we're seeing now. Much of it is to convert into condos, which is what a lot of this neighborhood is turning into, and the sub pockets or the sub neighborhoods in East Boston is turning into. And it's having a ripple effect through the other suburbs, right? The rental market is just as high anywhere in the immediate area. So far, that so much so that it's going as far north as Lynn, where, you know, community organizing entities and housing-oriented entities out there are taking over a tenant perspective as well, because they're feeling that pressure.
Thank you, Andre. I'm going to move now to Renell, and he's going to describe an example of multi-building organizing in 2 neighborhoods around the same landlord. Should be slide 19 there.
Hey, all, how you guys doing? It's a pleasure and an honor to be with y'all on this call. As Steve and Andres explained, you know, this is a war actually, but the war that we have, the folks that we fight against, they live in our neighborhood. They don't live in our neighborhood, but too often they own property that is in our neighborhood. We're talking the folks that we fight against are big landlord named APM, Advanced Property Management. They own over 300 units in the area of Hyde Park and then by River Street. And then unfortunately, most of the tenants that live there, they basically African-American, you know, or immigrants and folks who don't know that much English, or folks who are retired folks, or folks who are elderlies, and they just having rent increases that they can't afford, you know. And then too often when they just move out. And then we have a big issue in our we're getting shelter. We don't have enough places to really have. So what we do,
Renell, can you mute your computer?
Okay. Is it too high?
Okay, continue now.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. I lower it down a little bit. Yeah, so what's going on with these people is that conditions on those apartments are horrible. They have to live with mice, rats, roaches, and mold in the apartment. And then the landlord would refuse to fix them. But in the meantime, they would raise their rent so they can afford it. So what we urge them to do is not to pay the rent when they come to see us. We form a tenant association with them and help them to know how they could do to fight, and basically ask for agreement that would affect all of them. So that's how they'll be able to resist it. And they'll be there. Some of them been there for years. They don't have to pay the rent increase, and then they go in the court, and we're very effective that way against APM.
Thank you, Renell. So take it away, Darnell. And again, we're
All
honored to
right,
be here
thank
to be
you.
part of you guys.
Thank you so much, City Life Vida Urbana and the team for that. Walking us through what I pulled out of that was really some good information on the 3 types of ways that you organize with the building, the multi-building, and the multi-neighborhood. We're now going to turn it over to our next group. Our speakers are from the Citywide Union of Rochester. Our speakers are Mary Brown. She's with the Thurston Road Tenant Union. Kawana Smith with the Southview Towers Tenant Union. Liz McGriff with the Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester. And Ryan Acuff, who is also with the Citywide Tenant Union of Rochester. Take it away, guys.
Rochester folks, if you're trying to talk, you are on mute.
Rochester, we can't hear you. While we're waiting for Rochester to get their audio correct, I want to remind folks that the chat box is open for folks to put questions. Liz?
Yeah. Can you hear us now?
Hi, we can hear you now.
I will try because it wasn't working through the phone. We'll try through the computer.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kawana Smith from the Citywide Tenant Union and Southview Towers Tenant Union. We're going to talk a little bit about our Citywide Tenant Union and tenant process organization through one of our tenants of our local union. The building or landlord tenant unions are really the basis of our citywide tenant union process. And the building or landlord tenant union, also the tenant union process is at a much earlier stage than the Boston tenant union, as we're only 4 months old. We're building off other cities such as Los Angeles, Toronto, Minneapolis, and Boston, inspiration with the rent strikes. First, we're going to give you a little context about Rochester, New York. 63% of the renters, of the residents of Rochester are tenants, and we are majority people of color city. In addition, New York is a very landlord-friendly state and rated 39th in the country in tenant friendliness, tied with Alabama and Texas. And I'm going to introduce you now to Mary Brown.
Hi, I'm Mary Brown. I'm a tenant at 447 Thurston Road, Rochester, New York. First, I want to tell you a little bit about our building and the living conditions and our landlord. The living conditions that we're living in is raw sewage, electrical problems, mold, bed bugs, mice, rats, and squirrels eating their way into our building. Our landlord, he lives in Staten Island in a beautiful mansion, and he's not trying to fix anything, any of the problems that we're having here. We are living like animals within these apartments, and when we ask him to make repairs, when you call into the asset company that he owns, you can't get an answer. We began in January 2018, having meetings with Citywide Tenants Union, and then coming to our apartments, knocking on our doors, and from there we began to have meetings within the building to form a tenant union and to make plans about the conditions and how we wanted to address them. We also filed complaints to code enforcement with the city of Rochester so that they could be officially documented. We wrote a demand letter to the landlord that summarizes all the conditions of the apartment building. We also wrote a petition signed a petition, each and every one of the tenants within the apartment building, stating the conditions that we were living in, and we had them signed, and we sent them to the landlord. We got a lawyer that agreed to represent us as a tenant group to address our problems and to set up an escrow account for our rent. We had a public protest highlighting the conditions which we were living in within the apartment building. And one thing I forgot to say is within the apartment building, we have 4 doors that's unlocked. It's not secured at all. We also went to, we sent a certified notice, putting the landlord on notice that if he doesn't correct the issue, that we will be going on a rent strike, which we did. March the 1st was the date of our rent strike. So we have been on rent strike since March the 1st. In response to the rent strike, we have received tons of media and community support. Also, we have had meetings with the city officials to address the poor conditions that we were living in. The city of Rochester put the landlord on notice, saying that if they didn't make certain repairs, that they would take the apartment building into a receivership. Receivership is where the city takes over the building and they collect all the rent money from the tenant, and they use that money to fix up the apartment building. The tenants from the other buildings, we have 17 buildings, and we have got together with some of the tenants from the buildings, and they also want to join forces with us to form a tenant union of their own. And some of the tenants will be going on rent strike as of March the 1st. I will now turn this over to Liz McGriff to summarize the process.
Hi, my name is Liz, and I was a bank tenant, and I have won my house back through foreclosure. And I'm also helping with the tenants union. One of the ways that we do outreach is we go from door to door and talk to individuals and let them know what their rights are, and if kind of find out if they already have a tenant association within the building. If they do, then we work with them to kind of organize on the bigger issues that we're dealing with. If they don't, then we help when we talk to the people, we ask them, you know, are you interested in setting up a tenant association where you can unite against your landlord? A lot of the tenants are fearful because, you know, they're on a month-to-month income. So they don't want to really rock the boat where they live because this is the only means that they have. But with letting them know what their rights are, some do come around and say, hey, yeah, let's do this. And so we set up a date, and we, you know, invite all the tenants through canvassing again to the buildings, to those don't, and the people that are, you know, really dedicated to the move and want to see a change, they stick with it, and we kind of identify, well, we help them identify a leader in the voting process. So once we've established a leader, then we create a demand letter with all the issues for that particular unit, and we present it to the owner. And depending on if he receives it or not, sometimes, in some cases, we sat down with the owners and told them what the conditions are, and they tell us what they can do. They tell us, and we tell them what we're going to do. So in some cases, we sent a letter to Mary's landlord, and he didn't respond. So what we went from that point on, we did a public media attention. We went out, we invited news media. The news came in, took pictures of the place, put it on you know, put it out there. Still didn't get a response from the landlord. But because he lives in Long Island, so so the next step that we did was withhold rent, which Mary has already, you know, told you about. We sent a demand letter. Oh. Waiting for the slideshow to catch up with me. We did a public action. And so after the public action, a lot of the tenants went on rent strike and they're withholding their rent. And like she said, we got in contact with a lawyer through Law New York, and they're representing the whole building and supporting them in their struggle. And that's pretty much it. Thank you. Any questions?
All right. Is that all from Rochester?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both of our groups for sharing. And I noticed that folks have been putting things into the chat box, and so we'll get to those questions. Following right back up, I want to go right back to some questions that did come in. You both talked about mass meetings and what it is to have these mass meetings. How are you using mass meetings in the context of organizing and continuing to keep people focused and engaged? I'll turn it over to City Life first.
I think we lost that thread just for a second, Darnell. Can you just repeat that real quick? Sorry about that.
Oh, no. Both of you talked about using mass meetings as a tactic, as a way to pull people together. How are you using those mass meetings to keep people engaged and focused?
I got you. Well, starting from our end, I think there's a lot of ways in which people have a lot of tenant organizing calls mass meetings in order to inform people about their legal rights or to plan actions. And certainly we do that. But we found over the years that in some ways an even more important rationale for the meeting is to have a series of rituals that overcome people's feelings of isolation and alienation and, you know, feeling that it's their fault. So we have built into our meetings a lot of things where people come up to the front of the room to talk about their story when they're new, and they all hold the sword of power together, and we tell people to leave their shame at the door. We all pledge to fight with them. So a lot of things like that, we're using our meetings to sort of get at the emotional part of what it means to resist, because it's hard to resist. And when you fight as a tenant against a rent increase or against an eviction, you're going against a dominant theme that's out there in the air. So in our meetings, we're really trying to take those dominant themes and bring them down into the meeting and show that they don't work. They're not for us.
Rochester, how are you all using your mass meetings to keep people engaged? I think we may have lost them.
Usually, what we do is with excitement. Some of the people get to tell their story. A lot of it, we're still new, so we're learning a lot of different things. So, so far, what's happened, like in Quanas's building, people are, you know, they kind of welcome us once they hear, you know, they see the results, they see it on TV, and they see, you know, changes happening, and at least it's being talked about where it wasn't. So that kind of ignites people to be a part of it. And we do a lot of education too, just so people know their rights and they can, you know, because in one building, the landlord was telling the tenants, if you talk to media, then you know, I'm going to change the locks on your door. And what we told him was he can't do that. That's you know, called retaliation. And so I think it kind of ignites people to keep being involved and keep fighting. Mm-hmm.
A follow up to that thread and thought. In both your mass meetings, a lot of times the organizing is because of a crisis, but then you're also using mass meetings to educate folks. So how do you ensure good turnout at your mass meetings for folks that might not be readily in the crisis?
So I think for us, one of the ways that we do that is our members are involved in canvassing and letting other tenants and residents know that our work exists and that their work exists. So we print out flyers and our members pick up flyers at our meetings and they take those flyers throughout the neighborhood. They canvass. Sometimes just they hit hot spots like the train stations at hours that we know a lot of workers in the community are coming out. Sometimes they use lists drawn up of different LLCs or corporate landlords that have properties in the neighborhood. And sometimes they'll just hit up lists where Zillow or other sites are showing triple deckers are being sold with tenants there at tenant at will situations. And sometimes that even say, you know, building occupied but will be delivered vacant. So there are strategic ways in which we canvass, and our members lead that effort, and that's how we kind of spread the word about our meetings.
Cool. Andreas and or other City Life folks, can you explain how you go about or assess whether or when to push for collective bargaining? This is Dan from California.
I'm going to flip this over to Renell in a minute, but let me just say we're always trying to emphasize collective bargaining in some way, either to, even in the case of homeowners where we're trying to fit them into common campaigns against Bank of America or Fannie Mae or something like that. So we're always trying to emphasize that. Even in 2-unit buildings, we try to do collective bargaining. Renell, you want to say how collective bargaining has developed over the years at APM organizing?
APM, actually, it's still a struggle somehow because those owners, they're trying to get to the tenants one-on-one, saying if you don't negotiate with City Life, if you don't talk to them, we can reduce that rent increase that you were gonna have. We can work with you. But what they do, you know, is eventually they will try to evict all those folks later on. But those who know, those who've been with us for a while now, they know it's not in their best interest to negotiate with APM on the side. They would come, they would sit with us, and they would identify others also who are going to the same issues and have them come in our meetings. And then so far we've been winning that. And at the end of the day, we can talk now. They're trying to negotiate with us. For a few years, they refused to even entertain that thought. But now, not only they are listening to us, they're negotiating with us. It looks so good that in the next month or two, we might solve some major issue in the city because of all.
Darnell, if you don't mind, a quick comment from Andres.
But
Yeah.
If I can take the thread of the question as that there are sometimes tensions, or we can perceive that there are tensions in getting folks to understand that they should collectively bargain. I think obviously for the movement, it's important that tenants associate that with the strength of solidarity and what that means to build a movement. But I also think that in how we negotiate, at the very least in East Boston and in City Life, what we tend to do is you take the least common denominator, as in the tenant that maybe needs the strongest ask, and you lead with that. And you do such that you're communicating that if we can achieve that, then we're getting all the rest that everyone else wants. So for an example, there may be in an occasion a tenant who already had plans to leave a building that is currently being cleared out. And there may be a tenant who wants a 5-year lease or maybe a 2-year lease. So we lead with, hey, we want a 5-year lease. at X rent. And in the negotiation process, we may end up with a 2 or 3 year lease and some substantial move out offers. So the person who may have wanted to move out all along will still be able to take, if that's what they still choose, a move out offer that's much more substantial than where they negotiate on the side by themselves. So I think it's working to get everybody to present their needs as honestly and as clearly. And then from there, trying to map out a strategy that links everyone's needs together in a direction that allows them, right, to really bargain collectively. But I think, you know, if that's where the thread of the question's going, we see that a lot here, where people have different objectives. And so gearing how to join our demands is important.
Cool. I want to connect to Rochester because you all spoke about how you were inspired by the rent strikes and the energy and momentum around that. Has collective bargaining come into play in your assessment of what you all think you can push for?
Okay. What we've been doing is, in the demand letter, we try to turn it into we ask the landlord to agree to it and turn it into a legal document. We also, what we've been doing with Mary's building is there's other tenants that live in other buildings, and we kind of unite them and still, you know, we go for the same thing for the landlord to fix up the building. Another piece with Mary's building is we were able to talk to the city, and we got action done, you know, from the landlord because they were going to take it into receivership. So that was one of the ways it kind of lit a fire under the landlord because they gave him a deadline date to have everything fixed. If he didn't fix it within that deadline date, then they were going to take the money from the tenants and they were going to fix it. They were going to hire somebody, which is called a receiver, to fix the building, and the landlord wouldn't get any money. So immediately the landlord started fixing up stuff. But as far as collective bargaining, we always go back to our first demands and what we want.
Darnell, one more quick, I'm sorry. I think for people on the call that it really is important to note that we use the first thing we do in almost all tenant organizing is send what we call a public letter, which goes to the landlord with copies to elected officials. And that letter is usually fairly mild, but the fact that it's signed by a lot of people who are simply seeking negotiations, simply seeking to sit down and talk with the landlord is a very powerful thing. And so elected officials take a stand on our side, not because they agree with our demands, but because they think it's right to talk. But if we can sit the landlord down and actually talk with us through a mediator, we're halfway home because now our side's view, which is underrepresented, has now been legitimated as equal. So sending some kind of initial public letter that says exactly what you want, not what's legally possible, but what you want, and asking to talk is a really powerful weapon. You're muted, Darnell.
Can you hear me now? All right. Wanted to ask a question about funding structure. What is the consequences, or what consequences does source structure of funding have on strategy and tactics and the boundaries of your activity? For example, government funding versus foundations funding versus a dues setup and membership base. I'll turn it over to, we'll give that one to Rochester first.
Just as far as Rochester, this is Ryan. So we're all volunteer. So we don't have any grant funding or government funding, but so we definitely want to be very grassroots. But we're definitely open to taking grants or different types of money as long as it doesn't compromise the mission or compromise what we want to do, which is to take whatever actions are necessary, the types of escalation that are actually win. So we would never take money that would compromise our mission. We wouldn't want to take money that would in any way say that, well, we wouldn't target a certain politician or certain power player in town, right? The conditions are so bad, people being displaced at such a heavy level, that we need to have all options. We would only take money from, grants or foundation or anybody that would support our mission and our strategy, but nothing that we wouldn't take any money that would modify our mission in that way.
So,
Good.
Darnell, can you
Go
hear me?
ahead. Yes.
Okay. So from City Life's perspective, so we have, I think we put this on in the chat as well. We have funding from local foundations and from lots and lots and lots of individuals, mostly based in the greater Boston area, but some from around the country as well. So because we're 45 years old, we have had enough time to develop a pretty strong grassroots individual fundraising base. And so we have in the past definitely lost funders because of political stances that we take, and also because of particular targets like Bank of America during the foreclosure crisis. We don't let that stop us. We just continue to seek for values aligned funders, both institutions and individuals who believe in what we believe in.
All right, thank you. We have Diana Reddy from Fair Rents in Redwood City, California, who is a new organizer, and she is interested in the best practice for starting a tenant union. Can you all explain the difference between a tenant union and a tenant association, if there are differences or how you're using those as different? Anyone want to take a stab at answering what's the difference between a tenant union and a tenant association?
Well, there's, go ahead.
I know in Rochester, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I know a lot of times it's used interchangeably and for folks here, but typically one of the ways we distinguish it is to say that in many tenant associations, people come together to have social activities and to improve conditions. And we say that, tenant unions often do that as well, but with the explicit goal of building collective rights through some sort of tenant agreement or collective bargaining agreement. So we emphasize the idea of tenant union organizing as just one step above of what a typical tenant association might do, which is enforce collective rights, the goal being a collective bargaining agreement. But sometimes people use the words interchangeably, but that's just what we mean by it when we say we're specifically organizing a tenant union.
Okay.
Yeah, we kind of use
Are
them.
either one? Oh, go ahead.
We kind of use them
Go ahead, Steve.
interchangeably as well. And, we had a slogan for a while, a union at home and a union at work, so a tenant union and a labor union. So that kind of fit into the use of the tenant union, but in a way that I think Ryan was just describing, a lot of people who are just forming tenant associations or tenant unions and are nervous prefer the milder tenant association. And so we go with whatever people, feel comfortable with. It should be noted also that there are some subsidized housing developments that have a more defined requirement of what a tenant council or a tenant association is, and you have to look at those regulations. But generally speaking, our tenant associations don't have too much formal structure.
Okay. Steve, you touched on it by talking about Section 8 tenant unions. Are there lessons learned in your experience in organizing project-based Section 8? Or do you encourage that type of organizing?
Well, in Boston, we have done that. There's another organization here that specializes in that more. But we have organized project-based developments, and both around questions that involve the continuation of the federal contract, and more largely just nasty management practices. You know, and as time goes on, management companies that are seen as pro-affordable housing have some pretty bad eviction practices. And so we're trying to expose that and organize against it.
Okay. Here's another question. How do you approach organizing in a 99-unit building? Is it a large meeting or is it several small meetings?
I think the question here is more how many leaders and active units you have. Is everybody active? Because that tends to not be.
Might want to have Andre speak to that, and maybe Renell about your organizing at APM.
So I want to make clear, I'm not speaking out of direct experience in that I've organized a 99-unit building, because I have not. But in that, we do have a case right now of two towers that of 16 floors each that do not have active or working elevators. So you have 16 floors and there's no working elevator. You can imagine the type of problems that poses for all different types of folks. And that encompasses about 200 plus units. So I think the question there is how many people you have active as part of your tenant association, right? So it's not about, are you meeting with all 99 units if all 99 units are not part of your association, or at least not active parts of your association. But I do think then so for us, we have a space where we have our general tenant association or BTA meetings where all the associations come together once a week. And if we were to need this space a different day of the week to just host a bigger venue, then we could do that. And sometimes in buildings such as the one I'm talking about, the building itself comes with a conference space or a big enough lobby that you could even see if tenants felt they had the power to have their meeting in their lobby. So different iterations of that, but you're not fitting 99 units in one apartment, that's for sure.
I think in our case with APM, our success has come because that we were able to communicate with strong building captains, have those leaders organize each other and let you know what is mostly needed on one side or another, and then make those meetings as close to their turfs as possible. And at the times they could come in. I've seen that happen even on a cold day when those meetings take place. As an example, there is a community room on River Street. We have contacts of those who manage it, so we get access to it. We could organize our meetings on the fly. Folks do come in and they do share with us, but also we get those captains involved, and that has been the secret sauce so far that we find. It's doable. I would say you can have big meetings and also small,
Hi. I live in Southview Towers, and there's 193 units in our building, and 138 of those receive Section 8. And we have meetings every 2 weeks, and so we send out flyers. We try to get a great number of our tenants to come to our meetings and discuss the issues that we have going on. And so right now we have a big problem with management wanting to redo the whole building at one time. So we don't understand how they're going to fix all the pipes and move everybody and fix all the apartments at one time. So we're trying to get management to come to one of our meetings, and we're having a hard time. They keep saying that they're having different contractors and they're changing the floor plans, and it's just hard to really get them to come to the table and talk with us. So everything really has to be a threat with them. I always have to go to the media and talk about what they're doing and how we can go about to get them just to even talk to us.
All right. What approach in organizing do you suggest, and what type of events draw people in? Like the beginning event, those in Rochester started from a rent strike, but others start from other places. So what are those membership building type of events that draw people in?
Well, I'll provide one example. I mean, one thing that we use a lot in addition to the weekly mass meetings is vigils of all different kinds in front of buildings or in front of homes. And they're generally like, they're protesting whatever the bank or corporate landlord is doing, but they're really occasions for community building. So we've had a number of rallies recently where we have a brass band and we march through the neighborhood with the brass band. So we're, you know, we're angry about what's happening, but we're also celebrating our love. So that kind of feels like a good way to go about it to me.
Okay. Another question that just came in: how do you suggest membership building in a small city, 75,000 or less, when we've developed a citywide tenant union as opposed to a building association? Any advice on giving or connecting with other tenant renters in large rural areas like Manhattan? So if I'm reading the question right, they have developed a citywide tenant union, but now they're trying to think of membership building in smaller buildings and want to connect with people in rural areas.
I mean, kudos for developing that tenant association. Let's start right there. You know, I think any cases that come into the meeting of the citywide tenant association, any cases that come in that are politically compelling, that you can go do an action around, helps build your membership. Because all the actions are as powerful as in community development as they are in putting pressure on the landlord. They serve both purposes.
We have a simple question here. What constitutes retaliatory eviction? Folks in Pleasanton, California are questioning that.
Well, so for us in Massachusetts, if you were to exercise your rights in any way, and we broaden that to interpret like sending a conditions letter to your landlord, organizing with City Life, for example, if you were to exercise any of your rights complaining over conditions, and after that your landlord initiates an eviction proceeding, that is retaliation. And here we have the benefit that it's the burden of proof to prove that it's not retaliation falls on the landlord. So once you make the claim and have grounds to make the claim, the landlord has to prove that that's not true, and that helps us. And it lasts about 6 months. But I think in terms of technicality, the answer falls state by state.
What are you seeing as the biggest hurdles in building a tenant union or tenant association?
I'll tackle this one. Too often people don't know how much power they have because they're ashamed, they're afraid. They usually pack up and leave or refuse to get some help. They neighbors would know about them if they get evicted. That would be shameful, but they neighbors sometimes is going to the same situation. and because they're afraid, they're ashamed that they don't take action. I think it's a personal thing, but also the community also comes to play when that happens. If the community that actually don't receive them well, then they don't think they should fight to stay on. I mean, that's just me saying that.
A quick one, Darnell, is people come to us and they either don't feel that they have the power or they don't feel like they have justice on their side. They think that their case is individual, and so they blame themselves. That undermines as a huge barrier. And if they have overcome that one, then oftentimes they don't feel like they have the power, what Renell was just saying. So those are twin obstacles to overcome in any tenant organizing.
Yeah, and for us, you know, just related to the issue of power, many people just believe any action at all will result in eviction. And so I think the most powerful thing is, you know, is talking to other people that have organized. There's always risks involved, but that the sky didn't fall. You know, that people have done it, people have been courageous, and there's strength in numbers. And that's, you know, more than any abstract story or even rights that might exist in the books. Talking to people that have been through it and that have fought and that have won is one of the most effective ways for people to believe they actually have power and overcome their fear that we find over and over.
All right. How are you including seniors and persons with disabilities in your organizing? That's a question that came in.
Hey, I'm included.
Okay.
I would say all comers are welcome. Actually, all of us are disabled on one form or another. Too often we just afraid to admit it, but everybody needs help. So anybody who has any condition, we want them. We want to show them how much power they have and how much it can change that system that was designed to control us. So that's it. Everybody is welcome.
And of course, anytime you're doing mass meetings, especially citywide meetings, you need to have an accessible place. Hard to get sometimes.
Okay. Right. There's a couple of questions here that are all around the good practices for starting, because we have one group that's 4 years old. Rochester opened us up with that, and then City Life is 45. But someone that's just starting, I'm by myself, I live in a rural area, and I want to start a tenant organization or a union. What's my first step in starting? Anyone?
I would say
Rochester, you want to
first
go
step
first?
would be please reach out to City Life because we have the goods on how these things go, and any help that you want, we'll be able to coach you along the line. It's no issue at all. We love to help you.
Yeah, I mean, us in Rochester, we're pretty new too. I mean, as far as we've done different types of housing organizing, but we just really started focusing on tenant organizing more recently. But, you know, I always say, you know, we start with what we have, you know, and then even if it's a small group, and then we go through that process of just leadership development. Sometimes they call, you know, panning for gold. We talk to a lot of people and we see the people that really are dedicated, that really believe in the cause, that pay it forward, that see the larger piece, and starting with a team and going forward and talking to tenants and see what the largest issues are. You know, and we start with, you know, and labor organizing they call the hot shops, you know, the places where people are most ready. You know, if we talk to fixed buildings, some are lukewarm and some are ready to go. You know, and we follow the people that are ready to go.
All right.
Andres has more kind of recently organized our chapter here in East Boston and, you know, kind of from scratch. So we might want to have you
So
chime in.
when I joined City Life about 5 years ago now, and we were predominantly, this site was predominantly still a foreclosure site, as was most of the organization. And the chapter was much smaller as a foreclosure site, and it's really exploded as a tenant association. And I think Ryan from Rochester, if I'm right, who just spoke, really hit it, right? Which is establishing relationships within the community and community leaders. I think that's critical in developing tenant associations. And so I would say that's a really critical point. I think for me, it was facilitated in that I grew up in this area, so I had a lot of both cultural knowledge of the area, and linguistically, I'm also Latin American, and so it allowed me just to really relate to my community really well. But obviously, gaining the trust of the community and being able to build in those ways is what's going to help a lot in establishing a site.
All right. Any last minute advice or things you want to say on how you're organizing and how things are going in your area? So we'll start with Rochester. How is growth happening, and what are your plans and goals, and what do you want folks to know that's happening?
Yes. In Rochester, what we would like to see happen is we would go door to door to more buildings, canvassing, and talking to the people and educating the people about their rights as a tenant. Oh, and also by expanding the rent strike, letting them know that they can do that. You know, they don't have to be afraid to do that, and it's legal, because some people feel like it's illegal to do that. I think they will be evicted if they do it.
Yeah, I would say, I think in this vein in Boston that, you know, there is no neighborhood that's immune from gentrification pressures now. And especially those are communities of color, of course. And on the other hand, if people don't reach us, they move. If people reach us, we can defend them and they get to stay. And if they don't reach us, they move. Recently, we had the example of a 24-unit building that everybody was being evicted. And we managed to arrive there right after they got the eviction notices. And everybody joined the struggle and got the eviction cases dismissed. And now they're looking to have their building purchased by a nonprofit. But if we had gotten there a week or two later, they would have all moved. So that's the tension of tenant organizing, at least in a climate like Boston, that, you know, you can do a lot when people get together, but making sure that they get the information to get here is sometimes really frustrating.
Thank you. And you just talked on that a little bit, Steve, in that if we can get a lot of people together, a lot of things can change. Can either of you all talk about an experience or share where the work of the tenant organizing and tenant union has shifted policy as it relates to protections for tenants?
You want to go first, Rochester? Or anybody on the call?
Darnell, can you say it again? I heard you say something about the pocket, but I had trouble hearing.
Oh, and thinking about how tenant unions are bringing folks together around a certain concern, how has that worked in shifting policy or changing or affecting policy that protects tenants?
Yeah, I mean, so really of our citywide tenant union, we have two functions. So one is to support self-organizing in specific buildings and across landlords, so supporting tenants to empower themselves. And the second function is to identify what are the common issues across all tenants in Rochester. and through that and say, what are the policies that would do that? So the idea is we're supporting people to organize for contracts in their own building and win rights, but ultimately what we want to do is also negotiate the social contract and win rights for everybody. So we have our platform around, housing court with tenants, to give tenants the right to take their landlord to court and take over their buildings. We have rights around good cause eviction protections so people can't be arbitrarily evicted, and for expansion for universal rent control in Rochester. So what we do is our actions in our different buildings we use as a platform for our larger systemic changes. And we said, well, if we had these different things, we wouldn't need these other things, right? So if we had a housing court where the tenants could take their landlord to court, it never would have gotten this far, right? If we had a process where tenants could apply, there's certain protections in other parts of the state, but as we mentioned at the beginning, for most tenants in New York State have very little rights. But we believe we deserve the right to be able to take over our own buildings and run them ourselves. So we always highlight that if we had these things, we wouldn't be in these conditions. We wouldn't be living under these conditions because it's ultimately about a lack of power. So we use the base building, the organizing, and the larger media events to highlight the structural issues that we're lacking and what we're fighting for. And just in the last few months, we had our vice president of city council. So since we started organizing around our platform in July, we've got a bill into the New York State Assembly called the Rochester Housing Court Act, and in the New York State Senate. So they expand the rights of tenants to be able to take their landlord to court. And now the vice president of city council wants to start a task force on rent control. And just that change in narrative is a major change for us because what we've been told by even community elders is the words rent control haven't been used by public officials in Rochester in 3 or 4 decades. So the narrative is changing in a major, major way. Ultimately, we have to change state law to do that, but we're building support for that.
All right, thank you. Dave, you want to go?
I'm wondering if Lisa wants to chime in on that.
Sure. So I would say there are 2 really quick examples. A few years ago, City Life, along with Right to the City Boston, were really pressuring the city to name the displacement crisis as an actual crisis in the city through, and the pressure came through just linking all of the individual tenant associations across the neighborhoods into a citywide tenant union, and which culminated in lots of press, city hearings, that kind of thing. So as an interim step, we forced the city to develop for the first time a department within city government that was explicitly named to address the displacement crisis. So that was a victory, and although not policy, it was certainly a major change in city programming and allocation of resources. So secondly, we have been fighting for a just cause eviction protection ordinance at the city level, which because of Massachusetts law needs to get state approval. So we were able to win win over the mayor and the city council to, in essence, ask the state for permission for us to implement what was our just cause eviction ordinance, and now is a more mild but necessary ordinance to expand rights for homeowners who have gone through foreclosure and for the city to collect data on the displacement crisis. So that measure is now, it was only passed through a broad renter movement that Right to the City Boston led. And that measure is now sitting in the State House.
All right,
And-
thank you.
And just another example we forgot to mention on a local level, a policy change we just won was emergency repair program for tenants. So we called for, instead of the city was evacuating buildings where tenants were living without heat or poor conditions, we're saying instead of getting an order to vacate, to force to fix them up, the landlord won't fix them up, then to create a program where the city would come in, make the emergency repairs, and bill the landlord. And that way, not only improve the conditions for tenants, but not cause tenants to be displaced by no fault of their own. So that was through some of these specific campaigns in different buildings, we were able to get them to change their policy, create this program, turn it into a written policy, and now tenants can access as well on a local level.
All right, thank you so much. As we get ready to close this webinar, I just want to say thank you again to our two groups for taking the time to share with us. This call was just the beginning of our sharing and learning from each other. It is our goal to have these trainings each month in which we'll hear different aspects of tenant organizing training, as well as some in-depth conversations about what's going on in different cities and how that might be able to help you and where you are. Our next one will be on April 25th at the same time, 3 Eastern, 12 Pacific. I want to also let folks know that there's a National Assembly happening in Atlanta in July, as well as a Southern Assembly for those that are in the Southeast region in Nashville that's happening in May. And then you can join the Homes for All Renters' Rights Committee. For those that are on the call that are new, we invite you to join us and join one of our committees, which this training is being put on by the Renters' Rights Committee. Next slide. We've also started a library where we will put these recordings and encourage folks to share their materials and tenant organizing manuals with each other. Several of our groups, as you just heard, City Life has created a step-by-step, meeting-by-meeting manual that will help you give ideas as well as tools for how to create an agenda, how to do that outreach, when to do that outreach. And so please check it out and share materials that you would like to also learn from and add if you have some. We're in the process of developing a Homes for All tenant union manual that speaks to what is the common in building tenant unions across the country that we're lifting up, while also talking about some of the key differences based on the sector and renter class and geography of your work. We also want to invite you to join us for our upcoming assemblies, as you saw before. And in the chat box, we just posted some links to the registration, as well as for the Homes for All South meeting. If you are not a member of Homes for All, please sign the pledge, join the Tenant local committee, join Homes for All. We are here for you. A big thank you to all of our storytellers and our presenters today. We appreciate your time and your insight. I want to let folks know that those questions that were in the chat box, we will also share at the end of the recording, as well as a recording of this for those that missed it, and you can also share it with your folks back home. We'll be sending you all this recording and also the other links to it. Let's continue to join together and build a powerful tenant union and continue to win. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, Cecia.